4,000 years of human story. Battles and betrayals, miracles and massacres, empires assembling themselves from nothing and then coming apart at their foundations. The Old Testament is not merely a religious document. It is the most sweeping chronicle of blood, of belief, and of a people refusing to disappear that the ancient world ever produced. And the thing that stops you cold when you sit with it long enough, every part of it, from the first word spoken into an empty universe to the last prophet standing alone in the wilderness, moves along a single hidden line, a thread of intention woven through the whole. How does a text assembled by dozens of different voices, separated by centuries and continents, produce a story so unified in its direction that it reads like the work of a single mind? That is the question, and in the next hour holds the answer. Because even if you grew up hearing these stories at a dinner table or in a pew or in a classroom, there are things here that most people have never fully assembled into the shape they actually form. Everything begins with absence, not darkness. Absence. No dimension, no moment, no substance of any kind. The original Hebrew text of the first chapter of Genesis reaches for this with the phrase tohu vavahu, desolate and empty. This is not decorative language. It is the most ambitious attempt at description in all of recorded human writing. Before the first thing existed, the concept of before had no meaning. Time had not started yet. And then a voice spoke into that non-existence. Let there be light. No raw material, no mechanism, no sequence of steps. A command issued to nothing. So and nothing became something. And the universe did as it was told. What unfolds across the 6 days of creation follows a sequence that has unsettled scientists and theologians alike for generations. Light precedes everything else. Then the organizing of water and sky. Then dry land. Then vegetation. Then the ordering of the celestial bodies. Then life in the sea. Then life on the land. Whether this matches the cosmological record is a question people have argued across centuries. But the sequence itself, that it moves from the simple to the complex, from the diffuse to the organized, is not the sequence you would arrive at by accident. On the 6th day, something happens that did not happen before. God pauses in the middle of the work and speaks not as a command to the void, but as a deliberation with himself. Let us make the human being in our image. The plural is there. Let us. Theologians have spent millennia rotating this phrase, but whatever else it means, the point it makes about the human being is unmistakable. Everything else was spoken into existence. The human being was formed. Genesis chapter 2 says that God shaped the man from the dust of the ground and then breathed the breath of life into him directly. This is not the same operation as the rest. It is close. It is hands-on. It is something other than a word sent across the void. Adam wakes up in a garden, and the garden was not a pleasant place for a morning walk. The text places it in geography that the ancient reader would have recognized, rivers the Tigris and the Euphrates still cutting through the land of modern Iraq, but soil threaded with gold and aromatic resin and precious stones, fruit trees producing abundantly in every direction, and at the center of all of it, 2 trees unlike the others, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The terms of the arrangement were clear. An entire world with a single restriction. Do not eat from that particular tree. One boundary inside the whole of creation. And the consequence was stated without softening. On the day you eat from it, you will die. Not eventually. Not metaphorically. That day, Eve was made from a rib taken from Adam's side. The positioning has carried weight in theological commentary across centuries. Not from beneath him to be dominated, not from above him to stand in authority, from beside him to walk alongside, the two of them together in the garden, unashamed, managing a world that operated on its own without requiring their labor or their suffering. No decay, no death, no pain of any kind. That was what the garden was, the original version of what was meant to be. And then the thing that ruined it. A serpent. The text does not explain where it came from, or how it came to speak. It simply notes that it was more subtle than any creature that had been made. And its strategy was not a straightforward lie. It was a question shaped to introduce uncertainty. Did God really say you should not eat from any tree in the garden? God had said, one tree. The serpent rephrased it as all trees, a single degrees of separation shift from the truth that planted the first fracture in the history of the human relationship with God. Eve ate, Adam ate, and what the text says happened next is precise in its disappointment. Their eyes were opened, not to wisdom, to shame. The first impulse was to cover themselves, to sew fig leaves into something that had never before been needed. Something in their interior architecture had collapsed. And when they heard the sound of God moving through the garden in the evening air, they did something that had also never happened before. They hid, the creature concealing itself from its creator. The thing that had never needed to hide, hiding. The reckoning was measured and exact. For the serpent, a life pressed to the dust and a permanent enmity with the woman and her descendants. For the woman, pain in childbearing and friction in the most intimate human relationship. For the man, a soil that would no longer give itself freely, but would have to be extracted through toil and struggle, resisting and thorning and wearing him down until the day he was returned to it. And above all of this, death. Death entered the living world on that afternoon, and has never once been absent from it since. They were sent out of the garden. An angel carrying a flaming sword stood at the entrance, so they could not come back. That is the end of Genesis chapter 3. 2 generations of human existence and the entire original order has already been forfeited. If you think the expulsion was the bottom of the descent, wait, the bottom is lower. Cain and Abel, the first 2 sons. Abel keeps sheep. Cain works the ground. Both of them bring an offering to God. Abel brings the finest of his flock, the firstborn, the most valued portions. Cain brings from his harvest, but the way the text is written suggests he did not give his best. God receives Abel's offering. God does not receive Cain's. And in the space that opens between those 2 outcomes, the first fully human emotion makes its appearance. Envy, the awareness that someone else has what you wanted. God leans toward Cain before anything happens. Why are you carrying this in your face? If you do right, will it not be lifted from you? But if you do not do right, sin is crouching at the door. It has its eye on you. You must get the better of it. Read the intimacy of that. God directly addressing one individual about one emotional state before the worst of it has occurred. Telling him plainly, something is waiting for you just outside the door. You still have the choice. Cain does not take the choice. He leads his brother out into the field and kills him. The first death caused by one human being to another. And when God asks him directly where Abel is, Cain answers with a line that has never stopped circulating in human history. "Am I supposed to be my brother's keeper?" Abel's blood cries from the ground. Cain is cursed from the earth he worked. The soil will refuse him. He becomes a man without a fixed place, moving through the world untethered. And from there, the human line descends in a spiral that shows no sign of correcting itself. The genealogy in Genesis chapter 5 traces the line from Adam to Noah, and the numbers are bewildering. Adam lived 930 years, Seth 912, Methuselah 969, the outermost boundary of human longevity in the text. And nobody can say with certainty whether these figures are literal or symbolic, or calibrated to a calendrical system that has been lost. The text presents them the way you present a roster of known facts, and in the middle of this list, a single name interrupts the pattern. Enoch. In a genealogy where every entry ends with the same phrase, "and he died," Enoch's entry ends differently. Enoch walked with God, and he was not there because God took him. He simply ceased to be present in the living world. Where he went, the text does not say. But the absence of a death certificate for this one name has generated centuries of inquiry and speculation. Meanwhile, the human population is moving in one direction. Genesis chapter 6 delivers one of the most philosophically dense passages in the entire book. The sons of God, whoever they were, angels or semi-divine figures or members of a spiritually elevated lineage, take for themselves wives from among human women. The result is not specified clearly, but the general picture it introduces is unmistakable. The wickedness of the human race had grown until every thought, in every person, at all times, was oriented toward evil. Not sometimes, not mostly, every single one, always. And then, Genesis 6, verse 6. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and it caused him grief at his very core. The architect of the universe looking at the building and feeling pain at what it had become. The decision to send a flood is not made in anger alone. The text is careful to locate it in grief. And the one exception to everything that required the flood? One man. Noah. Righteous, blameless among his generation. He walking in step with God in a time when no one else was. God gives him an engineering commission unlike any before or since. A vessel 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet high. 3 levels, sealed with pitch inside and out. No rudder, no sail, no navigation system. It was not intended to go anywhere. It was intended to stay afloat. Consider what Noah's neighbors must have made of it. A man constructing an enormous watercraft in dry conditions with no visible weather event on the horizon for potentially over a century. The text tells us he preached the whole time. That 2 Peter calls him a proclaimer of righteousness, that not one person in his world came aboard. When the time came, God brought the animals to Noah, 2 of each unclean kind, 7 pairs of each clean kind. And when everyone who was coming was in, Genesis chapter 7 records one detail that carries a particular weight. The Lord shut the door. Not Noah. God sealed it. From outside. Whatever was inside was secured. Whatever was outside had no further access. The rain came, and it was not only rain. All the great springs of the deep burst open, water pushing up from beneath the earth while it fell from above. The mountains disappeared under 20 feet of water. Every creature that breathed air and lived on dry land died. Genesis is blunt about this without modulating the sentence. Every living thing on the face of the ground was wiped out. The ark rode on the water for 150 days before the level began to drop. 5 months. 8 human beings. An ark full of animals. No windows to tell the time by. Or no external reference for when or whether the water would ever recede. Noah sent a raven first, then a dove. The dove came back the first time with nothing. The second time it came back carrying an olive leaf freshly plucked. The third time it did not come back. The ground had dried enough to hold life. The first thing Noah did after stepping onto the earth was build an altar and offer a sacrifice. And God responded with a promise unlike any before it. Never again would the ground be cursed on account of humanity. Never again would every living creature be destroyed in this way. As long as the world continued to exist, there would be seasons, day and night, the cycling of the year. It would not be taken away. And to mark this promise, a sign was placed in the sky that had never been there before. The first rainbow. A covenant sealed not with one people or one nation, but with every living thing on the earth. But the fresh beginning did not stay clean. Noah planted vines, produced wine, drank more than he should have, and ended up lying exposed inside his tent. Ham saw him in that condition and went and told his brothers. Shem and Japheth took a cloak, held it across their shoulders walking backward, and covered their father without seeing him. When Noah came to himself and understood what had happened, he cursed Ham's son Canaan and blessed the other two. This moment feels small in the telling, but the curse on Canaan is a seed that will germinate hundreds of pages later, when a nation descended from Shem enters the land whose name is Canaan, and the collision between those two lines of ancestry begins. Nothing in the Old Testament is placed carelessly. Every element that appears early will resurface later. That is one of the things that, once you see it, you cannot stop seeing. The 70 nations recorded in Genesis chapter 10 fan out from Noah's 3 sons across the known world. The Semitic peoples from Shem, the Hamitic peoples from Ham, including the Egyptians and the Canaanites and the Philistines, the peoples of the northern and western regions from Japheth. Every war in the rest of the text is, at its root, a family conflict. Cousins who have forgotten the name. And then humanity tries something unprecedented. Building a city and a tower tall enough to reach into heaven, and making a name for themselves large enough to hold off the fragmentation they seem to sense coming. Babel. On the flat plains of Shinar, where the land offered no stone, they fired their own bricks and used natural tar as mortar. Human problem-solving applied toward an ambition that had no ceiling. And God did not address it with destruction. He addressed it with something more permanent and more elegant. He fractured their shared language. One day the bricklayer and the engineer could speak to one another. The next day they could not. The project dissolved. The people scattered themselves according to the language that made sense to them, which was exactly the dispersal they had been trying to prevent. Genesis 11 names the place Babel after the Hebrew sound for confusion, and humanity's first collaborative civilization ended not with fire, but with a misunderstanding that has never fully been repaired. Yet after 11 chapters that have taken the human story from the birth of the universe to the scattering of its inhabitants across the globe, the narrative performs a move that feels almost shocking in its scale. It narrows from all of humanity to one man, Abram, a resident of the ancient sophisticated city of Ur in southern Mesopotamia, a man almost certainly surrounded by the polytheism that saturated his culture. And God appears to him without introduction, without explanation, and says, "Go. Leave your land, your family, your father's household. Walk toward a land that I will show you. No coordinates, no itinerary, no guarantee other than the word of the voice addressing him. Just go, and trust the destination will be revealed." And Abram went at 75 years old, taking his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, everything they possessed. Send walking toward a horizon he had no map for. This act of departure, this particular kind of faith, is the anchor point for three of the world's largest religions. Every Jewish, Christian, and Muslim tradition has its root system in this moment. An elderly man with no children, answering a call no one else in his world heard. The terms of what God promised to Abram are the spine of everything that follows for the rest of the Bible. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name something that others speak with reverence. Those who treat you with honor, I will honor. Those who treat you with contempt, I will respond accordingly. And through you, every family of the earth will receive blessing. Read that last clause again. Every family on earth. This is not a promise made to one tribe for one tribe's benefit. It is a global commission planted in a single bloodline, intended from the beginning to extend outward until it touches everything. Abram arrives in Canaan, and God confirms this is the land. But the land has people on it: Canaanites, Perizzites, Hittites, settled populations with established cities and armies and cultural memory going back generations. And Abram is a wandering pastoralist living in tents. The distance between what is promised and what is visible is not a small gap. It is a chasm. It is like being handed the deed to a continent while you are sleeping in the back of a moving vehicle with no fixed address. And underneath all of this, compounding the impossibility, Sarai was barren. The promise was a great nation. A great nation requires a first generation. A first generation requires at least one child. And Sarai's body had never produced one. This tension, the enormous promise and the empty womb, will be the defining pressure of the next 25 years of Abram's life. 2.5 decades of watching the gap between what was spoken and what exists refuse to close. Imagine the weight of that. Imagine the nights when the sky is full of stars that God compared to the number of his descendants, and there is not a single child. In the middle of those years, everything moves at once. A famine pushes Abram down to Egypt, where he tells Pharaoh that Sarai is his sister rather than his wife, out of fear that her beauty would make him a target for elimination. Pharaoh nearly takes her. God sends plagues to interrupt it. Abram leaves Egypt considerably richer, but carrying a moral compromise that will become a pattern in the family across generations. His nephew Lot chooses the Jordan Valley near Sodom when they divide their territory, the better-looking deal at the time. 4 foreign kings invade the region, strip Sodom of everything, and take Lot with them. Abram assembles 318 of his trained fighters, pursues the invaders for over 100 miles, attacks them at night, and comes back with Lot and all the plunder. This is not the picture of a passive pilgrim waiting for divine provision. Abram could read a military situation and act with precision. On the road back from that battle, A figure appears in the text who has no backstory and no exit. Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High. He brings bread and wine. And he speaks a blessing over Abram. Abram gives him 1/10 of everything he recovered. And then the text moves on, and Melchizedek is simply gone. He will not appear again for nearly 1,000 years, when Psalm 110 mentions him in a single line, and then centuries after that in the book of Hebrews, where his significance is finally unpacked. Who was he in the moment of his meeting with Abram? The text declines to say, but the compacted weight of that single encounter has sustained theological inquiry across 2.5 millennia. The years continue to pass. The child does not come. And Sarai, tired of holding a promise that her body cannot confirm, brings Abram a practical solution. Her servant, an Egyptian woman named Hagar. Under the legal customs of the ancient world, this was an accepted arrangement, and a wife could provide her servant as a secondary wife through whom a legitimate heir could be produced. This was not outside the law of the time, but it was impatience. It was a human intervention into a divine process that had not yet completed its work. Ishmael is born. Abram is 86, and for the next 13 years he raises Ishmael, believing this is the son the promise was moving toward. Then Abram is 99, and God returns. No, the text says, the child of the covenant is coming through Sarai, not Hagar. Sarai, the 90-year-old woman whose body has never carried a child, and God changes their names. Abram, which meant exalted father, becomes Abraham, father of many nations. Sarai becomes Sarah, a word that carries the weight of princess and royalty. And the sign of the covenant is made physical. Every male in Abraham's household and every male born into his line will carry circumcision in their body as a permanent marker of the relationship. Sarah was listening behind the tent flap when the visitors delivered this news. She laughed. The laugh of someone who has been waiting 25 years and has decided that certain things are simply no longer possible. And the question came directly to her. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? The name given to the child born a year later was Isaac. In Hebrew, he laughs. Every time Abraham called his son's name, he was pronouncing the sound that had accompanied both his doubt and its resolution. But the test was not over. The text builds toward it slowly, and then delivers it in a sentence that contains perhaps the most brutal instruction in the entire Bible. Take your son, your only son, Isaac, the one you love, and go offer him as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. 25 years of waiting. A biological miracle. And now this. Abraham rose early the next morning. He cut the wood. He loaded the donkey. He took 2 servants and Isaac and walked toward the mountain. 3 days. The text gives us 3 days of that walk. 3 days of carrying what Abraham was carrying. When they arrived at the base, Abraham told the servants to wait. He and the boy would go up and worship and come back. Both of us, he said. Both. Isaac carried the wood on his own back. As they climbed the hill, he asked the question that must have nearly broken Abraham open. Father, we have the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the offering? And Abraham answered with the sentence that functions as the theological heartbeat of the entire Old Testament. God will provide the lamb for himself, my son. At the top of the mountain, with the altar built, and the wood arranged, and Isaac bound on top of it, and the knife in his father's hand, and the arm raised, an angel called from heaven, "Stop! Do not touch the boy. Look behind you." A ram caught by its horns in a thicket. The substitute had arrived at exactly the right second. Abraham named that place, "The Lord will provide." And God, speaking again, did something unique to this moment in all of Scripture. He swore by himself, because there was no greater reference point to swear by. And he reconfirmed the covenant in the strongest language the text possesses. The axis of the Old Testament has been located. A father willing to give his son. A son carrying the instrument of his own sacrifice up the hill. A substitute appearing at the moment of no return. The text does not explain what this pattern is building toward. It simply plants it, three-dimensional and impossible to forget, at the center of the story. Sarah died at 127 in Hebron. Abraham purchased a cave there from the local Hittite population to bury her, the Cave of Machpelah. This was the first legally acquired property his family owned in the land that had been promised. Not a palace, not a farm, a burial place. The promised land entered the family's possession as a tomb. This site stands in Hebron to this day and is among the most intensely contested pieces of ground on earth, sacred to both Jewish and Muslim tradition. Abraham sent his most trusted servant back to Mesopotamia to find a wife for Isaac, because, while Canaan was the land of the promise, it was not the land from which Isaac's wife should come. The servant arrived at a well near the city of Nahor and prayed with a specificity that was almost testing. "Give me a sign. When I ask a young woman for water, let her offer to water my camels too." Before the prayer was complete, Rebekah appeared. She offered water. She offered to water the camels. She was the daughter of Abraham's brother's son. She agreed to go back with the servant without delay. She married Isaac. The lineage held. But Rebekah was barren. Here again, the pattern of the matriarchs. Sarah barren. Rebekah barren. Rachel barren. Every single child in this family arrives as a miracle pressed through biological impossibility. And Isaac prayed for 20 years before Rebekah conceived. When she finally did, the pregnancy itself was a struggle. The two children were already fighting inside her. And God said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and the greater will serve the lesser." Esau was born first, red, covered in hair like a garment, already built for the outdoors. Jacob followed immediately, gripping his brother's heel. The name Jacob means heel grabber. It also means supplanter, deceiver. He spent the first half of his life being exactly that. Esau came in one day from the field ravenous, saw Jacob's lentil stew, and traded his birthright, the entirety of his inheritance as firstborn son, for a single bowl of food. The text calls it clearly. Esau despised his birthright, a decision made in the span of one hunger to alter the trajectory of nations. Because from Esau would come Edom, and from Jacob would come the 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel. But before Jacob was given the name Israel, there was a night on the bank of the Jabbok that the text describes with a restraint that makes it somehow more unnerving than elaboration would. Jacob had sent everyone and everything across the river. His wives, his children, his servants, his flocks. He was alone, and in the dark a man seized him. They wrestled until the first light of morning. No name, no explanation. Physical combat through the night between Jacob and whoever this was. Jacob, who had never solved a single problem with direct confrontation, who had managed every situation in his life through guile and positioning, was now in a fight he could not think his way out of. When the being saw he was not winning, and he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, and it came out of joint. One touch, and even limping in pain, Jacob did not let go. "I will not release you unless you bless me." The figure asked him, "What is your name?" And Jacob answered with his own name, his actual name, not his father's name borrowed, not someone else's identity worn like a coat. His name, Jacob. And the being said, "You will no longer be called Jacob. You will be called Israel, for you have contended with God and with people, and you have endured. Israel, one who strives with God." That name, born from a wrestling match in the dark beside a river, from an imperfect man who fought through his own brokenness and refused to release his grip even when he was losing, would become the name of a nation. A nation whose story would be told and argued and honored and disputed for the next 3,000 years. Jacob walked with a limp from that morning forward, every step a reminder that the blessing came with a wound. And to this day, this encounter is embedded in Jewish dietary law. The sciatic nerve of animals is not eaten because of the hip that was touched at the Jabbok. Jacob and Esau met the following day in an embrace and a flood of tears. Brothers reunited after 20 years of fear. But their paths separated again, and Jacob moved forward into the sprawling complexity of a family with 12 sons born to 4 different women: Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, Zilpah, 12 sons, and among them one who stood differently in Jacob's eyes: Joseph, the firstborn son of Rachel, the woman Jacob had loved from the beginning. Jacob gave Joseph a long, ornate robe. The brothers hated him for it, but the robe was only the surface of the wound. Underneath it were the dreams. Joseph dreamed that his brothers' sheaves of grain bowed down to his. He dreamed that the sun and moon and 11 stars prostrated themselves before him. And then, at the table, he told them these dreams. He was 17 years old and had not yet developed the judgment to know what not to say out loud to people who were already looking for reasons. When they saw him coming across the fields one day, sent by Jacob to check on them, the brothers said to one another, "Here comes the dreamer. Let us see what becomes of his dreams." They intended to kill him. Reuben talked them down to throwing him into a dry cistern while he figured out how to get the boy out safely. But Reuben was away when a caravan of Ishmaelite traders came past, and Judah proposed the alternative. "Why kill him? Let us sell him. He is our brother, our own flesh." They sold Joseph to the traders for 20 pieces of silver. They killed a goat, soaked his robe in the blood, and brought it back to Jacob. "Do you recognize this? Is this your son's coat?" Jacob, who had used the skin of a goat and the feel of his brother's clothing to deceive his own blind father, was now deceived by his own sons using the coat he had given in love. He tore his clothing and mourned for years and refused to be consoled. And Joseph was sold into Egypt, into the household of Potiphar, captain of Pharaoh's personal guard. And this is where Genesis begins doing something extraordinary. Joseph had been stripped of his father, his family, his homeland, his freedom, and his future. He had every justification the world could offer for despair or bitterness or surrender. And Genesis says simply, "The Lord was with Joseph." Not that everything immediately improved, not that the suffering was removed, just that presence continued. In Potiphar's house, Joseph rose to oversee everything, until the day Potiphar's wife began pursuing him day after day, with an invitation he consistently refused. "How can I do this thing?" he said, and sin against God? One day she seized his outer garment as he turned to run. He left it in her hands and fled. She used it to file a false accusation. Potiphar threw Joseph into the prison, from overseer of the household to the dungeon. Everything collapsed again. And the text says again, the Lord was with Joseph. In prison, the two officials from Pharaoh's own court were placed under his watch. Both of them dreamed the same night, and both were troubled by their dreams. Joseph offered to hear them. A cupbearer, 3 branches on a vine, grapes pressed into Pharaoh's cup. You will be restored to your position in 3 days, Joseph told him. A chief baker, 3 baskets of bread on his head, birds eating from the top basket. You will be executed in 3 days, Joseph told him. Both interpretations came true exactly as spoken. Joseph asked the cupbearer one thing: when you are restored, remember me and mention me to Pharaoh. The cupbearer was restored. He forgot. For 2 full years, Joseph remained in that prison, while a man he had helped lived freely and did not say a word. And then Pharaoh had a dream that none of his court could interpret. 7 healthy cows eaten by 7 gaunt ones. 7 full heads of grain swallowed by 7 withered ones. And the cupbearer, standing in the throne room, finally remembered the young Hebrew in the prison. Joseph was brought out, cleaned up, changed, and presented before the most powerful man in the world. Before Pharaoh could even frame the question, Joseph said, "The interpretation does not come from me. God will give Pharaoh what he needs to hear. 7 years of agricultural abundance across Egypt, followed immediately by 7 years of famine, severe enough to erase the memory of the abundance. Egypt needed to begin storing aggressively now, or the country would not survive." Pharaoh looked at this 30-year-old man who had been a slave and a prisoner, and said, "Can we find anyone like this one, in whom is the Spirit of God?" And that same day, Joseph was placed over all of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. He received the signet ring, fine linen clothes, a gold chain around his neck, a chariot of his own, an Egyptian name, 13 years from the pit to the palace. Every closed door, in retrospect, had been a hallway leading here. The famine arrived and spread beyond Egypt into the surrounding regions. Back in Canaan, Jacob told his sons to stop staring at each other and go down to Egypt where there was grain. 10 of them went. Benjamin, Rachel's other son, the youngest, stayed home. And when they arrived before the governor of Egypt and prostrated themselves with their faces to the ground, Joseph saw his brothers for the first time in over 20 years. He recognized them immediately. They did not recognize him. He was dressed as an Egyptian official in an Egyptian court. 20 years had passed. He was 30 years removed from the 17-year-old boy in the robe they had sold. What followed across the next several chapters is one of the most psychologically constructed sequences in ancient literature. Joseph accused them of being spies. He detained Simeon. He demanded they return with their youngest brother. He placed their silver back in their grain sacks to make them fear what was happening. He concealed a silver cup in Benjamin's bag to create a reason to detain him, to create the very scenario he himself had once lived. And watch what his brothers would do when one of Rachel's sons was threatened again. And when Judah, the same man who had proposed the sale 20 years earlier, they stepped forward and offered himself as a permanent slave in Benjamin's place, so that their father would not lose another son of Rachel, Joseph could not continue. He sent every Egyptian out of the room. And then he wept so loudly that the sound carried out into the court beyond the doors. "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" The brothers could not speak. They stood paralyzed by what the past had suddenly become. And Joseph crossed the room. And he said the sentence that is the theological summary of the entire book of Genesis. "You planned harm against me. God planned it for good, to bring about what is happening right now, keeping many people alive. Human malice was real. The suffering was real. The pit and the prison and the years were real. None of it was softened or dissolved. But God had been operating inside the wreckage of it, bending the trajectory toward something that no one could have calculated from within the experience of it. This is the central claim of Genesis. Not that suffering does not happen, but that it is not the last word. Jacob came down to Egypt with 70 people. Every name is listed in Genesis 46. 70. When this line leaves Egypt 400 years from now, they will number more than 2 million. Jacob met Joseph in Egypt and said, "Now I can die. I have seen your face. I know you are alive." He blessed his sons before he died, and the blessings were also prophecies. The one spoken over Judah carries the most forward weight. The scepter will not leave Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until the one to whom it belongs comes. Until the one to whom it belongs comes. The text does not name him, but the trajectory of the whole story has been bent in his direction, and it will remain bent there for 1,000 years. Joseph died at 110. His last recorded instruction was not about property or inheritance or the political future of his people in Egypt. It was about bones. "God will certainly come to your aid," he said. "When that happens, carry my bones up from here with you." He knew Egypt was not the destination. Egypt was the chapter. And so Genesis closes on a coffin in a foreign country and a promise still unfulfilled. Exodus opens with 7 words that pivot everything. There arose a new king over Egypt who had not known Joseph. A generation. That is all it takes. The people who had saved the country from starvation were now viewed as a liability. And the Hebrews had multiplied to a number that made the Egyptian ruling class feel threatened. First came the forced labor, the construction projects of Pithom and Ramesses, cities raised from mud brick and sweat under the delta sun. Then, when the population continued to grow despite the exhaustion of slavery, Pharaoh escalated. Every Hebrew boy born was to be thrown into the Nile. Every one. Systematic, state-sanctioned infanticide. Into this, a Levite woman hid her infant son for 3 months. When she could no longer keep him hidden, she made a basket from papyrus reeds, waterproofed it with tar and pitch, and placed the baby inside. She set it in the reeds at the edge of the Nile and left. The sister watched from a distance. Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe. She saw the basket. She opened it. The child cried. And the daughter of the man who had ordered the death of all Hebrew boys felt something in herself move toward the crying infant. Compassion arrived before policy did. The sister appeared. "Shall I go and find a Hebrew woman to nurse him?" And so the mother was brought back, paid from Pharaoh's treasury, to nurse her own son, in his own home, under the roof of the man who wanted him dead. The precision of this reversal is one of those places where the text seems to be making a point about the futility of planning against whatever providence intends. Moses grew up as a prince of Egypt. Languages, administration, military theory, Egyptian religion, everything a prince of the world's greatest empire would be educated in. But he knew who he was. At 40, he went out to look at the conditions of his people. And he saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew worker. He looked in both directions. He killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. The following day, he tried to intervene between two Hebrews fighting, and one of them turned the question on him. "Who made you ruler and judge? Are you going to kill me the way you killed the Egyptian?" Moses fled. From the palace of Pharaoh to the wilderness of Midian, prince to shepherd in a single day. He stayed for 40 years. 40 years herding flocks through a landscape that had no significance to anyone looking at it from the outside. God thought Moses needed 40 more years of preparation after Moses thought he was ready at 40. The desert he spent those decades in was the same desert through which he would later lead an entire nation. He learned every spring, every route, every landmark of it. In the school of obscurity, the curriculum was practical and specific. At 80 years old, a bush was burning but not burning up. Moses turned aside. From the middle of the fire, a voice called him by name. "Moses, Moses, take off your sandals. The ground beneath you is holy." God introduced himself, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob, and then he said something that had been 400 years in coming. "I have seen the affliction of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cry. I know their suffering. I have come down to deliver them. 4 centuries of silence from heaven. Generations born into bondage who never heard a word. And now 3 past tense declarations. I saw, I heard, I came." The silence was not indifference. It was the space before the action. The commission was direct. "Go. I am sending you to Pharaoh. Bring my people out." And Moses, who once acted without hesitation when he saw injustice, now hesitated with everything. "Who am I? They will not believe me. I cannot speak well. Please send someone else." Each objection God addressed, until the last one produced something the text describes as anger in God. But even in that anger, he did not withdraw the assignment. He gave Moses his brother Aaron as a voice, and sent them both back to the place Moses had fled from 40 years before. Moses stood before Pharaoh. "Let my people go." Pharaoh looked back at him. "Who is the Lord, that I should listen to him? I do not know your God, and I will not release Israel." He was going to know. 10 plagues, each one targeting a specific Egyptian deity in its own domain. The Nile turned to blood, which was an assault on Hapi, the god of the river. Of frogs covering every surface, which mocked Heket, the frog-headed goddess of fertility. Then gnats, then flies, then livestock disease, then boils, then devastating hail mixed with fire, then locusts that stripped every remaining green thing, then 3 days of darkness so complete it could be felt. A direct confrontation with Ra, the supreme solar god of Egypt. 9 times Pharaoh's heart locked, and he refused. And then came what there was no preparing for. At midnight, the destroying angel moved through Egypt. The firstborn in every Egyptian household died, from the son of Pharaoh on his throne to the son of the prisoner in the deepest cell. Not one was spared. But wherever blood from a sacrificed lamb had been painted on the doorframe, the angel saw it and passed over that house. Pesach, Passover. The name means to pass over. A freedom had a cost. Something died so that something else could live. That same night Pharaoh summoned Moses and said, "Leave, take everything, go now." And 600,000 men, not including women and children, walked out of Egypt with their possessions and their bread, that had not had time to rise, and the bones of Joseph, exactly as he had asked them to carry when the day came. But Pharaoh's resolve lasted about as long as his grief. He assembled 600 elite chariot units and pursued them to the edge of the sea. The Israelites were trapped. Water in every direction that mattered, and the army of the most powerful nation on earth closing in from behind. The panic in the camp was complete. Moses said, "Stand still. Watch what God will do today." God told Moses to lift his staff over the sea, but a strong east wind blew through the entire night. The water divided, 2 walls of it standing vertical, with a dry path between them. The Israelites went across. When the Egyptian forces followed, their chariot wheels were pulled off, and they could not maneuver. At dawn, the water collapsed back. Every soldier in that force died. Exodus 14. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the shore, and on that shore they sang. The Song of Moses in Exodus 15 is among the oldest surviving poems in the Hebrew literary tradition. Miriam took a tambourine and moved. Yesterday they were property. Today they were standing on the far side of the sea that had just swallowed their oppressors. Freedom proved more complicated than liberation. It is easy to take people out of captivity, and the far harder work is removing the captivity from the people. 3 days after crossing the sea, they were complaining about water. Weeks later, about food. If only we had died in Egypt. We had meat there. We had bread. They were already measuring liberty against the memory of a full plate. And God, with a patience the text never fully explains, sent manna, a substance that appeared each morning across the surface of the desert floor, thin and white, tasting of honey. Each person could collect enough for 1 day. Anyone who tried to store it found it rotted by morning. Except on the 6th day when they gathered double, because the 7th day nothing fell. For 40 years, without missing a single morning, it came. 3 months after the sea, the people arrived at Sinai, and what occurred at that mountain permanently altered the architecture of human civilization. God descended onto it in fire. The smoke billowed upward. Thunder shook the air and the ground simultaneously. The entire mountain vibrated. The people were told not to approach or touch the mountain on penalty of death. And from within the fire and the smoke, God spoke the 10 Commandments directly to the assembled nation. Not to Moses alone, to everyone present. Not as recommendations, as law. You shall have no other gods. You shall make no image to worship. You shall not use the name of the Lord as an empty vessel. Remember the Sabbath and keep it set apart. Honor the father and the mother. You shall not commit murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not lie about your neighbor in court. You shall not desire what belongs to someone else. 10 statements. The moral infrastructure of Western civilization rests on them. Every legal code from Rome forward traces some route back to this hillside in the Sinai. Alongside the 10 Commandments came more than 600 additional laws covering food preparation, hygiene, the administration of justice, the treatment of the poor, property rights, the structure of family life, agricultural practice, disease management, and construction safety. The book of Leviticus is nothing less than an operating manual for a people attempting to live with a holiness that matches the God they serve in a world that is contaminated in every direction, and at the center of the encampment, the tabernacle. A portable sanctuary assembled to specifications so precise that Exodus devotes 13 separate chapters to them. Gold, silver, bronze, linen dyed in crimson and blue and purple, ram skins dyed red, acacia wood, pomegranate shapes worked into the hem of the high priest's robe. Every element deliberate. The innermost room, the Holy of Holies, contained the Ark of the Covenant with the stone tablets inside. Above the Ark, the mercy seat, flanked by 2 golden cherubim facing one another. This was where blood was applied once per year on the Day of Atonement. This was where the presence of God among the people was localized. The Creator of the universe in a portable tent in the middle of the desert. Moses spent 40 days on the mountain receiving the full detail of the law. And below, the people could not endure the waiting. And they went to Aaron and said, "Make us gods we can see. This Moses, who brought us out of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him." 40 days. 40 days after God's own voice had spoken to them from the fire. After they had promised together, "Everything the Lord has said, we will do." Aaron gathered their gold earrings, melted them, fashioned the image of a calf, and told them, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up from Egypt." The high priest, the brother of Moses, the designated voice of God to the most powerful ruler in the world, organizing an act of worship that was the direct opposite of everything he had been appointed to represent. When Moses came down from the mountain and saw the celebration around the golden calf, he threw the stone tablets to the ground. They shattered at the foot of the mountain. The covenant, barely made, was already broken. The physical medium it had been written on outlasted it. 3,000 people died that day in the aftermath. And Moses went back up the mountain and said to God, "If you will not forgive this sin, then take my name out of the record you have been keeping." He offered himself in their place, and God made new tablets. The covenant was renewed, a second chance written in stone a second time. This is the heartbeat of the Old Testament. Sin, consequence, mercy, new beginning. It does not happen once, it happens hundreds of times. The pattern never exhausts itself. Moses sent 12 scouts into Canaan. 40 days. They came back with a bunch of grapes so heavy it required 2 men and a carrying pole. The land was everything God had described, flowing with milk and honey, exactly as promised. But 10 of the 12 gave the nation their conclusion. "We cannot take it. The inhabitants are massive. Next to them, we are like insects. We saw ourselves that way, and they saw us that way." 2 of the 12 disagreed. Joshua and Caleb said, "If God is pleased with us, he will bring us in." But the nation listened to the 10. They cried through the night. They said they wished they had died in Egypt. They started talking about choosing a new leader and going back to slavery, because the land of freedom had walls around it. God gave them the desert. 40 years. 1 year for each day of reconnaissance. Every person over 20 at the time of that vote would die in the wilderness without entering the land. Every single one. Except Joshua and Caleb, the 2 who had believed. The entire generation that had left Egypt under the miraculous outstretched arm of God, that had crossed the sea on dry ground, that had eaten manna every morning for 40 years, died in the desert because of 1 night of refusal to trust what they had seen demonstrated 100 times over. 40 years of funerals, day after day, month after month. The men and women who had stood at the edge of the Red Sea, and sung while Egypt floated dead in the water behind them, dying one by one in the sand. Even Moses failed. At Meribah, the people complained of thirst. Again, God told Moses to speak to the rock and water would come. Instead, Moses struck it with his staff. Twice, the water came. The people drank. But God said, "Because you did not trust in me enough to demonstrate my holiness before the people, you will not bring this assembly into the land I have given them." Moses, the man who stared down Pharaoh, who held a staff over the sea while the water stood up, who received the law on the mountain, who carried 2 million people on the back of his faith for 40 years. He would see the land. He would not enter it, for one strike of a staff born of frustration. The text is making a point about leadership that has no exceptions written into it. The larger the responsibility, the finer the margin. He who speaks for God before millions carries that margin in his hands always. Deuteronomy 34. Moses climbed Mount Nebo. From the summit, God showed him everything: Gilead extending to Dan, the territory of Naphtali, the lands of Ephraim and Manasseh, all of Judah as far as the sea, the Negev, and the Jordan Valley and the city of Jericho, the whole of the land sworn to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God said, "I have let you see it with your eyes. You will not cross over." And Moses died there, 120 years old. His eyesight had not dimmed. His physical strength had not declined. God buried him personally, and the location of his grave has never been found. The text places a marker over the end of his life. There has never been another prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Joshua took command. God said to him what he says to every person standing at the edge of an assignment too large for their ability. Be strong and full of courage. Do not tremble. Do not be dismayed. The Lord your God is with you in every place you go. The Jordan was at flood stage, impossible by any normal calculation to cross. God told the priests to carry the Ark of the Covenant down to the bank and step into the water. The moment the soles of their feet touched the river's edge, the water stopped. 2 million people crossed on dry ground. Again, the pattern from the sea repeated, as if the text needs you to notice it. The first barrier was Jericho, walls of stone, gates locked, the most reinforced city in Canaan. God's military instruction: march around it silently once each day for 6 days. On the 7th day, march around it 7 times. When the priests blow the trumpets, everyone shouts. That was the battle plan. Archaeologists excavating the ancient site of Jericho have found evidence of walls that fell outward rather than inward. Under conventional siege, walls collapse inward toward the attacking force. These walls fell outward, creating rubble ramps the attackers could walk up. Jericho fell without anyone's sword touching the wall itself. 7 years of campaign. 31 kings defeated. The land distributed among the 12 tribes according to the specifications in the law. And Joshua's final address to the assembled nation was not a tactical summary. It was a clean statement of what the next generation had to decide. Choose today whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. The nation chose that day. The generation after them was less certain, and the one after that had largely forgotten. The book of Judges traces the cycle that defines the following 300 years with a thoroughness that begins to feel intentional. Israel abandons the Lord. Neighboring powers gain dominance over them. The suffering becomes unbearable and the people cry out. God raises up a judge, a temporary deliverer, a specific person for a specific crisis. The judge delivers the nation. Peace lasts roughly a generation. Then the cycle resets. 12 judges, 300 years. Deborah, the only woman among them, directed the general Barak in a victory against 900 iron chariots under the Canaanite commander Sisera. Sisera fled on foot and ended up in the tent of a woman named Jael, who welcomed him, gave him milk, covered him, and when he slept, drove a tent peg through his temple. Gideon defeated an army of 135,000 with 300 men carrying torches inside clay jars and trumpets. No swords. Samson killed 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. He could not, in the end, withstand a woman named Delilah, who was persistent enough and patient enough to find the source of his strength and hand it to his enemies. The most physically powerful man in Israel was dismantled not by an army, but by what he could not master in himself. Judges ends with a line that functions as the epitaph of the entire period. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what seemed right in their own eyes. Complete moral dissolution. A nation governed entirely by individual preference. The people asked for a king. Samuel, the last judge and the first great prophet, warned them in detail about what a king would cost them: conscription, taxation, confiscation. The day will come, he said, when you cry out because of the king you chose, and the Lord will not answer. The people said, "It does not matter. We want a king like all the other nations have." God gave them what they asked for. Saul, tall, visually striking, a full head taller than anyone else in Israel. Exactly the kind of person people point to when they imagine what a king should look like. He started well. He did not stay that way. Power hollowed something out in him. He violated direct instructions about sacrifice. He preserved a king and livestock he had been told explicitly to destroy. When Samuel came to him with the accounting of what he had done, Saul explained. He justified. He listed reasons. He did not repent. And the verdict was irreversible. The Lord has taken the kingdom from you and given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. While Saul still held the throne, God sent Samuel to Bethlehem to an otherwise unremarkable man named Jesse. 7 sons passed before Samuel, and God rejected each one in turn. Is there another? The youngest. He is with the sheep. They brought him in, a young man with bright eyes and a ruddy complexion. And God said, "This is the one. Anoint him, David, shepherd, poet, soldier, king." The one described in the text as a man after God's own heart. Armed with a sling and a single stone, he walked down into the valley of Elah, where a Philistine warrior 9 feet tall, armored in bronze, had been standing every morning and evening for 40 days, challenging the Israelite army to send someone to face him. Not one person had moved. David looked at this figure and shouted across the valley, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin. I come to you in the name of the Lord of armies." One throw. The stone struck Goliath's forehead, and he fell face forward onto the ground. David's path to the throne was long and ran through caves and wilderness and years of being hunted. Saul turned on him the moment the people started singing David's name louder than his. David fled. He lived in hiding, gathering around him a band of men who were in debt, or desperate, or simply had nowhere to go. Twice he found himself in a position to kill Saul, and ended the threat permanently. Twice he refused. "I will not stretch my hand against the Lord's anointed." When Saul finally died in battle against the Philistines on the slopes of Gilboa, David did not celebrate. He composed a lament for Saul and for Saul's son Jonathan that stands as one of the finest pieces of Hebrew poetry in existence. David was crowned first over Judah, then over all 12 tribes, and he took Jerusalem from the Jebusites and made it the capital of the unified kingdom. He brought the Ark of the Covenant to the city in a procession so charged with joy that he danced before it in a way that his wife Michal found beneath the dignity of a king. And then God made David a promise that reaches further forward in the narrative than anything spoken since Genesis 3. Your house and your kingdom will endure before me forever. Your throne will be established forever. Forever. An eternal throne. The second most weight-bearing promise in the Old Testament. But David stood on his rooftop one evening and saw Bathsheba bathing. He wanted her. He sent for her. He slept with her. She became pregnant. And when the direct solution of bringing her husband Uriah home from the front to sleep with his wife failed, because Uriah refused to go to his house while his comrades were still in the field, David sent a letter to his general with Uriah, carrying it in his own hands. Position Uriah where the fighting is hardest, and then withdraw from him. Uriah died in battle. David married Bathsheba. And for months, nothing happened, until the prophet Nathan came and told a story about a rich man who had everything and stole the only lamb of a poor man who had nothing. David erupted. The man who did this deserves to die. Nathan said, "You are the man." The sword did not leave David's house from that day forward. The child born of the adultery died. His son Amnon violated his own half-sister Tamar. Absalom killed Amnon and 2 years later launched an open rebellion against his own father, sitting in the gate of Jerusalem and turning the hearts of the people. David fled the city on foot, weeping, barefoot, his head covered. The man after God's own heart, not because he was exempt from failure, but because when the prophet's finger landed on him, he did not do what Saul had done. He did not explain. He did not redirect. He said, "I have sinned against the Lord." Those were his exact words. Solomon inherited the throne from David and Bathsheba. When God appeared to him in a dream and offered him anything, Solomon asked for wisdom. He received wisdom, and with it, wealth and power on a scale the region had not seen. The temple he built in Jerusalem stands as one of the great architectural achievements of the ancient world. 7 years of construction, cedar from Lebanon, dressed stone, gold on the interior walls, and the altar, and the cherubim, and the floor itself. When the Ark of the Covenant was carried into the finished Holy of Holies, the glory of God filled the building in the form of a cloud so dense and so present that the priests could not remain at their stations. The portable desert tent had been replaced by a house of stone and cedar and gold, and God had moved in. But Solomon, the wisest man alive, made the most predictable error in the history of wisdom. 700 wives, 300 concubines, many of them foreign women who brought their religious practices with them. In his old age, Solomon's heart turned. He followed the gods his wives brought. He built high places for them outside Jerusalem. And the sentence came, "Because of this, the kingdom will be torn from your son's hand." Not all of it. One tribe will remain for David's sake, for Jerusalem's sake. But the rest will go. And after Solomon, the kingdom split. 10 tribes formed the northern kingdom of Israel. 2 tribes remained as the southern kingdom of Judah. Both began their long descent. The northern kingdom cycled through 19 kings over 200 years. Not one of them was evaluated by the text as having done what was right before God. Not one. Jeroboam erected golden calves at the northern and southern borders of his kingdom to keep his people from traveling to Jerusalem. Ahab married Jezebel and imported the full apparatus of Baal worship, complete with its ritual prostitution and the sacrifice of children. Against this, the prophets spoke. Louis Elijah confronted 450 prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel and asked the people the question the text keeps asking in different ways across the entire Old Testament. How long will you limp between two positions? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal, follow him. Fire fell from heaven and consumed everything on the altar, including the stones and the water that had been poured over it. The 450 prophets of Baal were executed that day, but even Elijah could not sustain the nation's direction. The spiral continued. In the south, Judah oscillated. Hezekiah was righteous and tore down the high places and reopened the temple. Josiah rediscovered the Book of the Law during a temple renovation and instituted the most thorough religious reform in the kingdom's history. And between them and around them were kings who sacrificed their own children to Molech in the valley of Hinnom outside Jerusalem's walls. And all the while the prophets kept speaking. Isaiah saw a suffering servant who would be pierced for the transgressions of others and crushed for their iniquities, and wrote it down 700 years before anyone could identify the reference. Jeremiah promised a new covenant, structurally different from the one made at Sinai, one that would be written not on stone, but on the human heart itself. In 722 BC, Assyria rolled over the northern kingdom. 10 tribes were deported and dispersed through the empire's territories. They were absorbed into the surrounding peoples and do not reappear as a unified group in the historical record. In 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon arrived at Jerusalem. He destroyed the city. He burned Solomon's temple to its foundations. He melted the bronze pillars and the Great Sea. He took the surviving population into exile in Babylon. Psalm 137 captures the particular texture of that displacement without looking away from it. By the rivers of Babylon we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Everything the covenant had promised was now ash or rubble or empty. The throne was unoccupied, the temple was gone, the land was in foreign hands. The covenant appeared to have reached its terminal point. 70 years of exile. But in Babylon, Daniel was thrown into a pit of lions for refusing to stop praying to God, and walked out the following morning without a mark on him. So his 3 companions were thrown into a furnace heated to 7 times its standard temperature for refusing to bow to Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue, and walked around inside it with a 4th figure who had no explanation, while the soldiers who had thrown them in died from the heat at the opening. And Daniel received visions of empires, their rise and fall and succession, describing Persia and Greece and Rome with a precision that historians and theologians have studied and argued over ever since. In 539 BC, Cyrus, the king of Persia, conquered Babylon and issued a decree releasing the Jewish people to return to their land and rebuild their temple. Ezra led the return and the reconstruction. Nehemiah rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem in 52 days, with his workers building with one hand while holding a weapon in the other, and their enemies watching from every direction. The people came back. The temple was rebuilt, smaller than Solomon's, simpler. The Ark of the Covenant was not in it. It had vanished from history at the destruction of the temple and has never been recovered. When the oldest men who had seen the first temple saw what the second one was, they wept, not with joy, with the weight of what had been lost. But the prophet Haggai told them, "The glory of this latter house will be greater than that of the former." And then the Old Testament closes. Malachi, the last prophet of the Hebrew canon, wrote around 430 BC. After him, silence. 400 years of it. No prophetic voice, no new word, no recorded divine intervention. 400 years in which all the promises were still outstanding. The throne of David, still empty. The suffering servant of Isaiah, still unidentified. The new covenant of Jeremiah, still unwritten on anyone's heart. The scepter of Judah, still in suspension, waiting for the one to whom it belongs. All of them arrows shot and still in the air, still traveling, still finding their trajectory across the centuries. The Old Testament does not end. It suspends. It is not a period at the bottom of a page. It is an ellipsis. Every war, every sacrifice, every failed king, every promise spoken and repeated and renewed across 1,000 years, every lamb slaughtered on every altar, points forward toward something the text itself cannot yet name. And if you have stayed with this story from the beginning to here, you have understood something that most people who have encountered pieces of it never fully see. When the Old Testament is not a collection of unconnected religious stories gathered between two covers, it is a single narrative following a single arc, from creation to fracture, from fracture to promise, from promise to waiting. And the waiting, as the story will go on to reveal, is not the end. It is the space immediately before the arrival of everything it has been building toward from the very first word.